minutes. I probably would have pulled you in a little earlier because we were going to have a translation on one of the for one of the panelists. But at this point in time, the second panel is as important as the first because it deals with a subject, agriculture, that used to be the most important thing about Ukraine. If you, in the old days, if you talked about Ukraine, oh, the breadbasket of whatever it was, I guess it was the breadbasket of Europe. So agriculture. And I'm going to hand it to someone who was here at the very first conference. This is the 26th conference. And we were talking about Bugajski in the moment of silence for him. I want to say that the individual that I'm about to introduce is probably one of the finest economists in the world. And he's about to run this section. I think you heard him and the ability at fingertips to give you the information he gave you. So, Anders, I'm proud to have you again with us. Okay, it's all yours.
Thank you very much, Walter, and for your kind invitation and your even kinder words. It's a pleasure to be here again. And I thought I should start with, I spent the second week of September in Kiev, and the first impression you get whenever you go to Ukraine, if you don't go to the front, is everything is surprisingly normal. You can cash money with your American credit card in a bank. You can buy and eat everything that you want. There's a bit of traffic jam, less than before the war, but traffic jam, and people walk. And would you notice things that are not quite as usual? Of course, you see all these memorials about fallen soldiers, rightly so. And then I took long walks in the mornings. I realized that very few people were out. So then I asked why. Well, because many employers are allowing their workers to sleep in the morning, since they often have to stay up at night for what reason. And I was there at two conferences. In one conference, all of a sudden there was air alarm. So then we moved down to a conference room underground within a few minutes, and they had the PowerPoint ready there so that we could just continue. So showing how people have adjusted to an abnormal situation. But the main thing, it was drones, drones, drones. So everybody talks about how Ukraine can now produce millions of drones in 1,500 startups. And as you heard in the former sessions, there's an enormous pride in Ukraine, how good the entrepreneurs are. And previously, we have heard that Ukraine needs arms. Now the tone had changed very substantially. We need money. We produce the best arms ourselves, and we produce them better, cheaper, and they are more efficient. So now it's much more a question of providing the financing. And one news that has not been much noticed, that is, Financial Times reported that in September, only 6% of US Patriot missiles hit their targets. So Bill Courtney said in the previous session that the Russian missiles have become much more efficient, more effective. And that's an unfortunate situation. And you might have noticed that when the Danish airports had problems with Russian drones, they asked for technical assistance from Ukraine to get the drone interceptors that Ukraine has developed that are very good at taking down the Russian drones. So we are really seeing that Europe now needs Ukraine, very much so when it comes to arms. But let me move over to what this session is supposed to deal with, agriculture. And I'm simply interested in agriculture, not from a business point of view, but rather as a student point of view. And of course, Ukraine has always been very impressive. It used to be 40% of Ukrainian exports that was agricultural goods. Now it's 60%. And the reason is that the steel and iron ore exports that used to be 40% has now collapsed to about half of what was. And you can say that Ukrainian agriculture is what is holding up the best. It was strongly modernized from the privatization of agriculture in just after 2000. And then it has gone on, and it's not falling back in spite of the war, in spite of all the mining. It has taken, of course, some land that is occupied, but the expected harvest this year is 75 million tons of grain and oilseeds, which is very impressive. And many of the problems we used to talk about have disappeared. If you take 10, 15 years ago, we complained about the lack of elevators, no more a problem. If we talk about 5 years ago, it was a problem with the railway transport. I was actually on the board of Ukrainian railways, Zaryckyj, for 2.5 years. And one of our steady complaints was that the farmers couldn't get rail cars. Now I asked, and they said that it's a problem, there's a surplus of rail cars. So there's too much overcapacity in the rail transportation. You don't hear about that because you don't hear about problems that disappear. And then what has been absolutely vital for Ukrainian agriculture is to have shipping over the Black Sea. And there was an agreement with Russia from in 2022 about a grain corridor, and then the Russians closed it, and the Ukrainians opened it nicely themselves from September 2023. And since then, there have been, I think, 3,000 commercial ships that have passed through and transporting mainly grains, but not only, also, for example, iron ore and steel. So this functions perfectly well. And the solution, which I think is what we should see as the general solution of how to handle Russia, Ukraine has taken out the Russian fleet. The Russian Navy in the Black Sea is no longer a force. All the surface ships are now, to the extent they haven't been taken down, have now fled to Novorossiysk or Abkhazia at the eastern part of the Black Sea. So this is what should be done further on, what former Minister of Defense Andrei Zaryckyj calls strategic neutralization of Russia, so that Russia should not find it possible to attack Ukraine any longer. And the next step, to comment on what has happened now with the oil sanctions that were introduced yesterday. 90% of all oil export from Russia come now from the Baltic Sea, that's 50%, and 40% from the Black Sea. And these are choke points. Denmark could close the straits, I mean physically. Öresund Strait is only 9 meters deep, and these are very narrow straits, and Bosphorus is probably even more easy to close. So Russia is in a very tight situation. And with these sanctions yesterday, which the US introduced yesterday, the UK did it before, the EU is doing so today on the Lukoil and Rosneft, it should be possible to stop a lot if they are followed up consistently. So I see only on Twitter today that there are reports that the Indians and the Chinese are not taking Russian oil any longer. It remains to be seen if that is true. But if it comes to that, then Russia is in a real tough spot. And I dare not, I was very surprised by these the sanctions that they come, but it remains to be seen. This is a real possibility, so we might see a change in it. But coming back to agriculture, this simply the best functioning part of the economy. When you drive, go by train as I do, from Ukraine, you see wonderful, to Poland, you see wonderful, well-tended fields in Ukraine. And then you come to small, poorly managed fields in Poland. So there is such a sharp contrast that Ukraine is so superior in agriculture. So in this session, we should discuss how to proceed further. And do we have Ambassador Roman Waschuk on?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay. Yeah, so let me introduce the speakers as they start speaking. Roman Waschuk has been working as a Canadian ambassador, first to Belgrade and then to Kiev 2014 to 2019. And then for the last 3 years, he has served as Ukraine's business ombudsman. And the Ukrainian business ombudsman is an independent position financed by the European Union. And the aim of it is to make sure that the business environment functions well. So, Roman, it would be very interesting to hear what have you learned on this arduous job, and what would you like to see further improved, in particular with regard to agriculture, but not only. Please, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Aslund. And it is a challenge to be able to say something original after a moderator who has already covered all the fields of Ukraine.
My apologies.
I would just note, maybe just for context, and of course we have Ukraine fans and obsessives and experts here, but still worth recalling that Ukraine has two quite different modes of agricultural production. It has large-scale industrial agribusiness, and it is almost unparalleled in terms of its size, which accounts for about 54% of Ukraine's arable land and about a similar percentage of gross domestic agricultural output. And then you have the rest being about 46%, diverse set of small and medium-sized family farms, rural households, and they produce about 46% of production, especially things more geared towards domestic consumption in the home market. So the big agribusinesses produce grains and oil seeds for export, as well as other products, sugar beets, whereas the smaller size sector produces things like potatoes, vegetables, fruits, a lot of Ukraine's dairy and meat consumption. Just to give you an idea of the scale of the large-scale sector, MHP, which started off as a regional agricultural warehousing company in Kyiv Oblast, Mironivsky Hliboprodukt, MHP, is by now a leading poultry producer in Europe, never mind Ukraine, and in fact in the top 10 poultry producers worldwide. Its land bank is 360,000 hectares, which is 890,000 acres across 12 regions. So these are companies that generally do not come and ask for my assistance because they are huge. They've got the accounting section, the legal section, the resources, not only to solve problems in Ukraine, but to solve problems in export markets worldwide. So in other words, I think, again, as Professor Aslund has said, Ukrainian agriculture is a success story, and it's a success story with global reach. It's not simply a sector that needs more aid projects and busybodies to come lecture it. It is now a fully fledged participant in global markets. To the extent that companies do have problems, and some do, including not so much the big Ukrainian producers, but Western companies that engage in export, it is with the traceability of Ukrainian harvests. In other words, the Ukrainian tax office always suspects that big companies are actually buying product from smaller producers who may not be on the tax office screen, as a result of which companies can have repeated audits. We try to help them through that process to make sure that they actually do get the VAT refunds that both they and their producers deserve. There are also sort of, if you will, the unintended consequences of intense anti-corruption rules and legislation. One case we've come up against is the requirement in Ukrainian legislation and the procedures of the tax office to ensure that you have precisely identified beneficial ownership, to ensure that no money goes astray or goes to bad people. The problem appears when, for example, the big foreign partner is an agricultural cooperative with tens of thousands of member owners. At this point, the Ukrainian system goes haywire, can't handle that information, and it then takes a long time to try and persuade them that tracking down every American farmer co-op owner is not something they need to do to be able to verify a deal and return VAT export monies. So these are generally not super widespread problems, but they are ones that crop up, if you'll pardon the pun, because of inflexible rules that are being applied to what is a dynamically changing sector. I'd also point out that one of the challenges that Ukraine faces is agricultural protectionism in other countries, which do not have the scale that Ukraine has developed. That is particularly true of the European Union, particularly true of Central European neighboring countries. It has resulted in the formal termination of trade preferences for Ukraine, the reinstatement of EU export quotas, although it has to be said in fairness that many of those export quotas have been expanded. Agriculture also is one of those areas where there is often an inverse relationship between volumes and prices. So there are, in fact, situations, and we see this, for example, in Ukraine-EU trade, that the impact of the termination of the very open preferences has not been as extreme in monetary terms as many had feared. So, for example, there were forecasts that Ukraine would lose up to 1.2 billion in agricultural revenues because of the changes and the reinstatement of export quotas. As it turns out, because quotas were increased in higher value products or products with more value added, that the actual loss to Ukraine was more in the neighborhood of $300 million or euros, I'm sorry, which has ended up being approximately 0.6% of Ukrainian agricultural exports. So in a sense, like with Ukrainian battlefield news, if you're overly focused on the battle for one village, or if you're overly focused on the quota for one product, it's quite easy to lose the bigger picture, which remains one of a resilient sector that has regained most of its access to seaborne export capacity, and one where, despite, for example, over the past marketing season, a decline in volumes, the actual return in monetary terms for Ukrainian agricultural sector has been greater than in the year before. So that, of course, also explains why it accounts now for 60% of Ukrainian overall exports. This is one has to hope that other sectors will erode that disproportionately large number. There is also the problem, and this is, again, cases that we have been recently engaged on, of sudden changes to Ukrainian legislation. Now, this is, I think, a bugbear for people who follow Ukraine or try to do business. The tendency to try for quick fixes through last-minute amendments to legislation that often do not have thought-through implementation strategies attached to them. The latest example we saw, and that was in the month of September, was a provision that was voted on in second reading in July to impose a 10% export duty on soybean and rapeseed canola, which then entered into force on the 4th of September with zero implementation mechanism. In other words, basically stopping much of the exports in that sector for a month until the Ukrainian customs authorities came up with the rules according to which origin and taxation and duties could be determined. So I think it's a successful sector, but the Ukrainian government has to avoid sudden jerky moves that undermine producer and investor confidence in the sector.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Ambassador Waschuk, and in particular, I think it was helpful how you develop the foreign trade complications. And I would now like to turn to Kent Dale here on my left side, who is the president of K&M cattle company in Texas, producing cattle from birth to processed beef. And for the past 15 years, Mr. Dale has been involved in humanitarian work in Ukraine. And we have now praised the Ukrainian production of grains and oilseeds. It doesn't look so good when we come to cattle. So what should Ukraine do in order to get its cattle breeding going? Right. The floor is yours.
Thank you. And Anders, when you opened up, you said that agriculture was not really your passion. It's your passion, but maybe you don't make money off of it. But I do want to state, if you eat, agriculture is impacting your life. So anyway, thank you, and I want to thank Walter for inviting me. The conference is Ukraine's Quest for Mature National Statehood. agriculture and specifically beef production can play a role in achieving this goal. When you look globally, the global beef market is driven by consumer demand. Year over year, beef demand has continued to increase around the globe. There are a lot of factors that impact that, and I'll hit on three of those. Most countries are experiencing a mass urbanization of their population. Many countries are seeing a development of a middle class, something that is unseen, puts more dollars in people's pocket. In developing countries, populations are shifting to a high protein diet. This increase in consumer demand for beef can be seen in the dollars that are being spent globally to purchase beef. The global beef sales last year in 2024 were $459 billion. The forecast for 2025 is going to be $485 billion. And most economists believe by the year 2032, globally, beef will be traded at the level of $656 billion. This is a huge market. The top 5 beef importers, and my statistics come from the National Beef Wire in 2024, were China. China imported 8.32 billion pounds of frozen beef. The United States, which I'm a producer here, imported 4.38 billion pounds. And then Japan, South Korea, and the United Kingdom all imported around a 1.5 billion pounds or a little bit lower. With the growing demand for beef around the world, Ukraine is perfectly positioned to capitalize on this market and develop a beef cattle industry. That would enable them to claim a market share of a growing global beef trade. Ukraine has all of the natural resources needed. They have grasslands, croplands, they have grains, they have grain byproducts, they have a willing labor force, and they have the export ability to move frozen beef out of the country and not just into the EU, but around the world. While Ukraine has always had the needed resources, it has never developed a large-scale beef cattle industry. Their cattle industry has simply been built around milk production. Even the limited domestic beef markets utilize cull dairy cattle that are then sold in markets inside the country. Since there's been so little beef cattle focus, the high quality cuts of meats are imported to meet even their domestic demands. According to the United States Department of Agriculture's Foreign Ag Service in 2024, so during the wartime, Ukraine purchased $9.79 million worth of frozen beef from other countries. And that is simply to meet high-end restaurant and supermarket or grocery store type demand. 5.3 was from Brazil, 3.4 was from the US, and 1 million was from the EU. While the financial impacts of this can be seen clearly, relying on other countries for protein could impact the entire economy of Ukraine. I read an article that the European Business Association published in May of 2025 is actually written by BDO. And I think you guys know who BDO is, so I won't go too deep there. But I want to read 2 statements. First quote, the beef industry in Ukraine is at a critical stage. A further decline could lead to the loss of even residual positions on the global market and a deeper import dependency. At the same time, the organic market, export margin potential, and positive price dynamics offer a chance for restructuring. This requires targeted action, investment in agriculture technology, farm modernization, logistics development, and support for small and medium-sized producers. A comprehensive strategy for the industry is needed. The second part of that article, second quote I want to make is, It is worth noting that the share of beef imports in Ukraine has increased between the years of 2014 and 2024. This confirms the beginning of a change in the model of meeting demand from self-sufficient to dependent upon other countries for their imports. Given the military and logistical risk, this trend could jeopardize the country's food security. The article reflects the current trend. However, the trend does not have to be followed. Ukraine could develop a beef cattle industry, an industry that would strengthen their economy, that would capitalize on the global beef demand and would strengthen their food security, reversing the trends that were mentioned in the article. While simply reversing the trends would be beneficial, Ukraine needs industries that will help lift the overall economic conditions and contribute to the future of the country. A thriving beef cattle industry would not solve all of their problems. However, it would help change the economic landscape both in the short and long term. The economic impact of a beef industry could have on Ukraine is hard to forecast. However, to get a view of what a beef industry can do, I want to share some data on the Texas beef industry, my home state. Keep in mind, Texas has a mature beef industry that's been developed over the past 150 years, and it would take Ukraine multiple years to scale up. However, the numbers do reflect what Ukraine could develop over time with the right technology. My numbers come from the Department of Agriculture, the Texas Cattle Feeders Association, and the Texas Department of Agriculture. In 2024, Texas had 12.2 million head of cattle. 3.7 head were marketed as hanging beef, finished in a feedlot. $16.25 billion in revenue in Texas alone from cattle. 124,000 ranching jobs, 2.3 million people directly employed in agriculture, 4.4 million people employed in jobs connected to agriculture. And the cattle industry in Texas added 8.8 billion to household earnings in 2024. Over time, Ukraine could develop an industry that generated half of those numbers. That industry would make a notable impact on the overall economy. A thriving beef cattle industry could have that type impact on Ukraine in the years to come. Ukraine resources coupled with the genetic and technologies of the United States beef industry would be the best starting point. The United States leads the world in beef production efficiency. In the U.S., beef producers are standing on the shoulders of pioneers in beef technology. And to quote the National Cattlemen's Beef Association, U.S. beef production is the most sustainable in the world thanks to decades of improvement and innovation by farmers and ranchers. Today, we produce 17% of the world's beef with 6% of the world's cattle due to scientific advancements in animal nutrition, genetics, and production practices. Genetics, with the help of universities and breed association, the genetics of the U.S. beef herd have improved over the years. This improvement has produced a beef animal that yields more meat with lower input cost. Animal nutrition. Research in this field has changed the use of grain byproducts in the U.S. today. Grain products are used in cattle feed, which helps to decrease the competition between grains for feed or grains for food. Advancements in corn, grain, sorghum, soybean, and wheat milling have improved feed efficiency, resulting in more beef production with less grain usage. Forages and grasses. With grassland management through weed control and grazing rotation, more beef can be produced on a per acre basis than ever before, while protecting the rangeland for generations to come. Production practices, vaccines, parasite research has improved the health and efficiency of cattle production. Handling methods and facilities reduce stress on the cattle and allow them to grow in humane ways. These innovations are part of the reason that the U.S. produces 17% of the world's beef with 6% of the world's cattle. The U.S., we produce the safest, highest demanded beef in the world. By modeling the U.S. beef industry and developing strategic partnerships with U.S. producers, universities, and the Department of Agriculture, Ukraine could begin to develop a beef industry using cutting-edge technology and genetics. There are 4 sectors to a competitive beef industry, each relying on the other for success. The cow-calf sector utilizes a female cow herd that carries and nurtures a calf from conception to weaning. These cattle utilize grasslands very efficiently with very minimal additional supplements, mineral and supplements in the winter, ultimately converting an unused natural resource of grass into beef, which can be eaten or consumed by humans. Furthermore, these cows will have a productive life of about 14 years. Small and mid-sized producers are very important in this sector. The stock or cattle sector, the calves are weaned from the cow herd. They're grown on grass in the summer, or they're grown on wheat, oat, and barley pasture in the winter without impacting the yield of those small grains. These forages provide low-cost, all-natural feed for the calf as they grow through their progression in the beef cycle, and normally these calves grow for about 150 days. The feedlot sector, when grazing season ends or the desired weight is reached, the stock or cattle are placed in smaller pens and fed grain-based feeds to finish them. Being fed a grain-based ration grows the feeder to around 1,400 pounds. I know I've got to wrap up, so I'm going to have to skip a little bit else what I've got. But for Ukraine to develop a beef industry that would revolutionize the agriculture economy and help their country rebuild, several things must be looked at within the country. Number one is they need to embrace the current technology. The government, universities, and business communities should be willing to develop strategic partnerships with their U.S. counterparts. These partnerships would allow U.S. genetics and production practices to be brought to Ukraine. Other reviews that would need to be needed would be land availability and usage. How free a market is the land market in Ukraine? That is something that would need to be started in Kiev. Taxation. What does taxation look like? Do there need to be adjustment to their tax laws? Banking or money supply. Can there be a banking system developed that would help producers start? Does that come internal? Does that come from the world? I don't know, but it is something that is needed. And then the legal system also needs to be looked at, because cattle producers have unique liabilities, and those things would need to be addressed. A very important thing, and our other panelists mentioned it, small and medium-sized producers would need to be engaged, because they need to be a part of this cycle. In the U.S., they are the backbone of our industry, and in Ukraine, they could be as too. I truly believe with proper planning and buy-in from the government and the business community, Ukraine could develop a beef cattle industry that would create jobs, create wealth, meet domestic demand, allow Ukraine to become a global exporter, and increase the country's GDP. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me follow up with a couple of questions here. Here we have the grain production, which seems to be structurally perfectly fine. And then we have animal husbandry, which seems to be a complete mess. As I understand it, most beef was produced on small private plots, one cow or so, and people have stopped doing it when they have become slightly richer. Of course, that's an arduous way of making money. And then the big sovkhozy, they died in one way or the other because they were highly irrational as enterprises and not profitable. And then there wasn't anything. That's really, these are the fundamental elements. And the medium-sized farms that you're favoring, they never existed really, or were extremely rare. So something needs to be done at this level. I mean, we can leave the genetics and all those things aside. First, you need to have enterprises that can work. You mentioned here the legal aspects. That sounds, but why can the grain producers get organized in no time on probably 1/3 of the agricultural land, while so little has been done about the animal husbandry?
That's a great question, and probably one that I could spend all afternoon discussing. I will tie this to the U.S. Really quick. Our Department of Agriculture has always had a way to provide funding for small and medium level producers, which enable them to become involved. Now, in the U.S., because there were other large producers always willing to buy those cattle, it created a supply chain that relies heavily upon each other. And so I think part of it would start with Ukraine's focus on wanting to develop this industry and then bringing in incentives that would make this attractive, not just to the large. I think the large producers can buy into this very quickly, but I think for it to ripple through the entire rural community, it needs to be addressed in some type way, and probably from the government way. In the US, it worked very efficiently with lending practices.
Thank you very much. Let me then turn to Pavlo Chumak, who's the president of Sunpro, a big Ukrainian entrepreneur in Mykolaiv area. And he is the head of an international group of companies, and in particular, a big agricultural producer. So please, Pavlo, offer us your insights. The floor is yours.
Спасибо. Вітаю вас, пані та панове. Вітаю весь світ.
I greet the whole world.
Дякую за приєднання, за можливість приєднання до цієї конференції.
Thank you for the chance to be part of this conference.
Пане Волтере, дякую вам.
Thank you, Walter.
Дякую пану Роману Попадюку.
Thank you, Mr. Roman Papadyuk.
Мало хто знає в Україні, але він зробив цю прекрасну неньку Україну.
Many people don't know, but he's one of the founders of this great Ukraine.
Дякую весь світ за підтримку.
Thank the whole world for your support.
Дякую народ України.
I want to thank the people of Ukraine.
Дякую моєму народу України.
And I want to thank my people.
За те, що він робить це.
Because they are doing this.
На містах.
In the cities.
В тилу.
In the rear areas.
На війні.
In the war.
Хто як може.
Who everybody does what they can.
Я маю маленький спіч.
I have a small speech.
Я хотів би сказати, що в Україні багато проблем.
I would like to say that Ukraine has many problems.
І мало хто о цьому говорить.
And very few people talk about this.
Я хотів би з вашого дозволу зачитати, і в мене є можливість це донести до вас.
With your permission, I'll read it so that you'll have this information.
Сьогодні увага всього світу звернена до трагедії, яку переживає український народ.
So the whole attention of the whole world is focused on the tragedy that the Ukrainian people are enduring.
Але справжній успіх України залежить не лише від перемоги на фронті.
But the true success of Ukraine not only depends on victory on the front,
а й від того, чи зможе країна виграти мир, який прийде після війни.
But whether Ukraine will win the peace which will come after the war.
Поточний підхід до відновлення повільний, бюрократичний, еволюційний.
The current approach to reconstruction is slow, bureaucratic, and evolutionary.
І це веде Україну в глухий кут.
And this is leading the country into a dead end.
Україні потрібна економічна революція,
Ukraine needs an economic revolution,
а не поступова адаптація старої системи.
not a gradual adaptation of the old system.
Навіть якщо Україна завтра завершить цю війну,
So even if Ukraine wins this war tomorrow,
Україні потребується десятиліття,
Ukraine will need decades
щоб згадати своїх сусідів
to catch up to its
за
neighbors
рівнем життя.
on the level of standard of living.
Це шлях до демографічної катастрофи.
This is the road to demographic catastrophe.
Мільйони біженців не повернуться до України без перспектив.
Millions of refugees will not return to a country without prospect.
А ті, хто залишився, продовжать виїжджати.
And those who remain will continue to leave.
Головна загроза суверенітету України не російські танки, а економічна безперспективність.
So the main threat to Ukraine are not Russian tanks, but economic hopelessness.
Країні належить відновлення на $1 трильйон.
So Ukraine needs to be reconstructed for at least $1 trillion
При ВВП близько 100 мільярдів.
with a GDP of only about 100 billion.
В цих умовах традиційні реформи означають стратегічну поразку.
So under these conditions, traditional reforms lead to strategic defeat.
Потрібен не ремонт, а
We-
перезагрузка.
We don't need a repair, we need a restart.
Перетворення України на економічну вільну, технологічну та інноваційну привабливу державу.
We need a transformation of Ukraine into an economically free, technologically advanced, and investment-attractive country.
Ми пропонуємо зосередитися на 4 стовпах перезапуску системи України.
So we propose focusing in on 4 pillars of a restart.
Перше – це українська бюрократія.
First, we deal with the Ukrainian bureaucracy.
Це гальмо зростання держави.
This is the main brake on growth of the country.
Наприклад, бізнесу доведеться збирати десятки документів, проходити нескінченні перевірки та постійно стикатися з проявами корупції.
So, for example, businesses are forced to collect dozens of documents, go through endless inspections, and face corruption at every step.
Треба повне перезавантаження регулярної системи.
So we need a complete reboot of the regulatory system.
Треба скасувати усі норми.
All the norms have to be liquidated.
Це включає максимально швидше відділення земель під промислові об'єкти
So this includes streamlining land allocation for industrial projects and simplifying
та спрощення підключення до комунікацій.
and simplifying the connections to utilities.
Це допомога буде бізнесу.
This will be help for businesses.
Це ефективна антикорупційна стратегія.
This is an effective anti-corruption strategy.
Усуваючи точки контакту з чиновником.
If you limit the amount of contact with bureaucracy,
І прибираючи корупцію.
and you get rid of the source of corruption itself.
По-друге, це податкова архітектура.
And the second is a new fiscal architecture.
Податкова система має стимулювати зростання, а не карати ініціативу.
So the tax system should encourage growth, not punish initiative.
Замість складської системи пільг та винятків потрібна проста, прозора та стабільна система з широкою базою та низькими ставками.
So instead of a complicated systems of exemptions and privileges, Ukraine needs a broad tax base with low, transparent, and stable rates.
Фіскальне навантаження має зміщуватися з податків на виробництво у податки на споживання.
So the fiscal burden needs to shift away from taxes on production, meaning labor and capital, towards consumption-based taxes.
Щоб зробити економіку більш адаптивною та інвестиційно привабливою.
To make the economy more flexible and investment-friendly.
Третє – це енергетична революція.
The third is an energy revolution.
Україна зіткнулася з парадоксом.
Ukraine is facing a paradox.
Маючи значну дешеву генерацію електроенергії за рахунок атомних і гідроелектростанцій, України ціна електроенергії для промисловості у кілька разів вищий, ніж у США.
So despite having substantial bases of low-cost electrical generation from nuclear and hydroelectric plants, industrial electricity prices in Ukraine are several times higher than in the United States.
Це економічний абсурд,
This is an economic absurdity.
який робить будь-яке українське виробництво неконкурентоспроможним.
And this makes any Ukrainian manufacturing uncompetitive.
Високі ціни – це наслідок невартості генерації.
The high prices aren't a result of generation cost.
Це неефективний ринок.
This is a dysfunctional market structure.
Ключові проблеми включають масштабну боргову кризу в секторі,
So key issues include a massive debt crisis in the sector,
неефективність системи державного регулювання
an ineffective state regulator,
та фактично ручне управління енергетикою
and
страни.
a de facto manual mode of governance.
Війна загострила ці проблеми,
The war has exacerbated these problems.
знищила значну частину керуючих потужностей,
So it destroyed a significant part of generating capacity,
близько 9 МВт,
around
Gigawatt.
9 gigawatts,
і змушує країну покладатися на дорогі імпорт енергії.
and forcing the country to rely on expensive energy imports.
Доступ до дешевої та надійної енергії є необмінною умовою для залучення великих промислових інвестицій.
So access to cheap and reliable energy is a must for attracting large-scale industrial investment.
Жодна міжнародна компанія не збудує завод в Україні,
No industrial company will build a plant
де електроенергія водночас є дорога і ненадійна.
in a country where electricity is both costly and unreliable.
Якщо Україна зможе використати свій потенціал,
If Ukraine can leverage its potential
щоб запропонувати тарифи
to offer industrial tariffs
більш конкурентні, ніж у США,
that are more competitive with or even lower than those in the United States,
вона миттєво стане одним з вигідних напрямків для енергетичної галузі.
it will instantly become one of the most attractive destinations for energy-intensive industry,
Хімія, металургія, машинобудування,
such as chemicals, metallurgy, and machine manufacturing.
ефективна енергетична країна – це ключ, який прикриває промислове майбутнє України.
So an effective
Відкриває.
energy is the key that unlocks Ukraine's industrial future.
Четверте – промислове позиціювання України.
Fourth, industrial positioning of Ukraine.
На тлі глобальних геополітичних зрушень перед Україною відкривається колосальна економічна важливість.
So amid global geopolitical shifts, Ukraine has a tremendous economic opportunity before it.
Йдеться про те, що Україна може стати новою промисловою базою для західного світу,
Ukraine can become a new industrial base for the entire Western world
запропонувавши західну угоду.
by offering a new kind of deal.
Ми приведемо найрадикальнішу пробізнесову економічну трансформацію.
We'll undertake the most radical pro-business economic transformation.
А натомість захист зробить Україну основним напрямком для своїх інвестицій.
In return, the West will make Ukraine the primary destination for its investments.
Це перетворить
This will
західну допомогу
reframe Western assistance
з благодійності на спільні інвестиції у створення нової безпечної промислової бази для всього світу.
from charity to a joint investment, creating a new, secure industrial base for the democratic world.
Ця панель нашого столу, вона присвячена агробізнесу.
So the panel of our roundtable is dedicated to agribusiness.
Хочу підкреслити, що аграрний сектор – це окремий напрямок.
So I want to emphasize that the agricultural sector is a crucial area
який потребує особливої уваги.
which needs special attention.
Україна володіє одним із самих великих запасів потенціалу з виробництва, продовольства,
So Ukraine possesses some of the most fertile land in the world.
біопалива та розвитку конвенційних агротехнологій.
A temperate climate and immense potential for food production.
Інвестиції в сільське господарство
Investment in agriculture
та переробну інфраструктуру
and changing the infrastructure
можуть перетворити Україну не лише на експортера сировини, як зараз,
can turn Ukraine from an exporter of raw commodities,
а на лідера готових продукцій
but into a leader of high value goods
з високою доданою вартістю.
with a lot of added value.
Це створить сотні тисяч місць роботи.
This will create hundreds of thousands of jobs,
Збільшить знаходження в бюджет
will increase export revenues,
та забезпечить сталий розвиток регіонів,
and ensure the sustainable growth in regions affected by the
які
war.
пострадали від війни. Але окремо хочу сказати про інтерес США.
But I want to speak separately about the interests of the United States.
Для Сполучених Штатів підтримка України – це інвестиція в стійкість і розвиток усього східноєвропейського регіону.
So the United States, for the United States, Ukraine is not a matter of geopolitical games, but it is an investment in the resilience and development of the entire Eastern European region.
Успішна Україна може стати не лінією поділу, а мостом між Заходом і Сходом.
A successful Ukraine can become not a dividing line, but a bridge between West and East,
Створюючи простір стабільності,
creating a space of stability,
взаємовигідної торгівлі
a mutual beneficial trade,
та енергетичної безпеки.
and energy security.
Економічно відновлення України має велике значення.
So Ukraine's economic recovery is significant and is far beyond its national borders.
Яке виходить далеко за її національні межі. Чим міцніша українська економіка,
The stronger a Ukrainian economy,
тим менше ризиків для сусідів
the fewer risks for its neighbors,
і тим більше можливостей для співпраці.
and greater opportunities for cooperation.
Сучасна Україна може стати майданчиком для технологічного співвиробництва,
So current Ukraine can become a platform for technological collaboration,
аграрних і енергетичних проєктів,
agricultural and energy projects,
що об'єднають ринки Європи та Євразії.
which will connect the markets of Europe and Eurasia.
Підтримка реформ в Україні не повинна сприйматися як крок проти сусідніх держав.
So supporting reform in Ukraine should not be seen as a step against neighboring countries.
Навпаки, це шлях до формування стабільності регіону,
On the contrary, this is a path towards building stability in the region,
де інтереси всіх сторон збалансовані на взаємному поважанні.
where interests of all sides are balanced and respected.
Для Америки це стратегічний імператив,
So for America, this is a strategic imperative.
для Європи гарантія стабільності,
For Europe, it's a guarantee of stability.
для Росії можливість відбудувати нові прагматичні відносини
For Russia, an opportunity to build new pragmatic relations
на основі взаємної поваги
based on mutual respect
до економічної вигоди.
and economic benefit.
Україна може стати не полем конфлікту, а прикладом того, як навіть із трагедії можна створити архітектуру співпраці і миру.
So Ukraine can become not a battlefield, but a model of how, even from tragedy, an architecture of cooperation and peace can be built.
Для реалізації сказаного ми пропонуємо створити Міжнародну економічну консультативну раду.
So to bring this into effect, we propose the creation of an International Economic Advisory Council.
Платформою для цієї ініціативи може стати клуб Unity,
So the platform for this initiative could be the Unity Club,
створений у 2025 році
founded in 2025,
для об'єднання професіоналів, які прагнуть допомогти Україні.
for the unification of professionals who are committed to helping Ukraine.
Ця рада розробить план кардинальних змін в країні,
So this council can develop plans for radical change in the country,
перезавантаження економічної політики та державного управління.
the reboot of economic policy and public governance.
Місія цієї ради може бути чіткою, амбітною.
The mission of this council can be clear and ambitious.
Працювати безпосередньо з українськими реформаторами над розробкою та впровадженням радикального плану трансформації.
To work directly with Ukrainian reformers on designing and implementation a bold transformation plan.
І цей заклик адресований передусім успішним, мудрим і сміливим.
So this call is addressed first and foremost to the successful, wise, and courageous,
Експертам Сполучених Штатів
the experts from the United States
та всього міжнародного співтовариства,
and from the whole world community,
економікам, економістам і політикам,
to economists and policymakers,
які мають досвід дерегуляції
which have experience in deal regulation
та скорочення державного втручання,
and reducing government intervention,
лідерам бізнесу,
leaders in business,
які можуть принести не лише інвестиції,
who can not only bring investments,
а безцінний досвід
but invaluable expertise
побудови конкурентоспроможних глобальних компаній.
in building globally competitive enterprises.
Україні потрібен не просто план відновлення,
Ukraine doesn't only need a recovery plan.
їй потрібен набор рішучих заходів
It needs a set of bold measures
для швидкого зростання.
for accelerated growth.
Ми запрошуємо всіх найбайдужих експертів долучитися до визначення ключових кроків.
So we invite all who are concerned to join in the defining of these key steps.
І тільки та країна стане привабливою для повернення іммігрантів
Only then the country will become attractive for the return of immigrants
і побудови процвітаючого майбутнього.
and the building of a prosperous future.
Час еволюції минав.
The
Треба
time for
зробити
revolution is
революцію.
over. Now we have to make a revolution.
Спасибо.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for a strong speech with a call for a fundamental transformation. The two questions are, do you see much popular support or support in the relevant elites for this kind of a program, which is not only a radical transformation, but also radical deregulation? And the other question is, how does it your ideas fit with the EU accession process? Do you see that as something that would promote your ideas, or would it complicate it?
Ваші ідеї співпадають із процесом прийняття до Європейського Союзу? Чи вони їх будуть сприймати, чи ні?
Дякую.
Дякую за запитання.
Thank you for the question.
Підтримка багата.
So there's a lot of support.
І якщо ми здесь, вона є.
So if we're here, obviously there's support.
Європейський Союз.
The European Union.
Нам треба робити ринок з усіма
We have to make a market with
странами
everybody,
миру.
with all the countries of the world.
І у нашої держави повинен бути свій курс розвитку.
And our country has to have its own path of development.
Ми все можемо зробити самі.
We can do all this ourselves,
І треба це робити.
and we have to do this
Зі всіма
with
партнерами
everybody, with
миру.
all world partners,
Європа,
Europe,
Євразія,
Eurasia,
Сполучені Штати,
United States,
all the peace.
all of the pieces.
Ми приглашаємо усіх
We're calling everybody.
в клуб Unity.
We're inviting everybody to the
І ми це
Unity,
зробимо в місті.
and we'll do this together.
Дякую.
Thank you.
Дякую. We have Timothy Milovanov.
Міліванов був, але зараз
Oh, sorry, I didn't know.
пішов, не знаю, чи це проблема.
Можливо,
з,
тривога в Україні.
Так, probably щось ще. Він весь час слухав, а зараз відпав,
Mm.
Я думаю, він вже там розповів про це.
мабуть.
Okay, questions?
Посмотрим. Вопросы мне.
Please. Introduce yourself. Please.
Yes, my name is Yaroslav Martinyuk, formerly with a researcher with Radio Liberty. My question is directed at Anders, something he said that's absolutely astounding in his introduction, that 90% of Russian oil comes through the Øresund Strait, which is only 9 meters deep and only, if I recall, just a few kilometers wide. My question is, what is preventing the West from closing these Øresund Straits? Is it the fact that it's part of the Montreux Convention, or is it a fear that it may be interpreted as a declaration of war in Russia? Well, to them, I say something very simple. Russia has declared war in the Baltic Sea already by cutting cables, harassing shipping, and drones harassment.
Thank you very much, Jaroslav, for an excellent question. It's 50% of the Russian oil that is exported through the Baltic Sea and 40% through the Bosphorus. So together it's 90%. But why is it like this? From the 15th century until 1857, Denmark controlled Øresund and the other straits. So, and then we had the Crimean War, which led to a peace treaty, which also included access to the Baltic Sea. So since 1857, commercial shipping into the Baltic Sea is free for all. Previously, it was only Denmark and Sweden. But what I like more in this part is that another part of the Crimean peace treaty was that the Black Sea was demilitarized from 1857 until the Berlin Conference in 1878. That is, Russia did not have the right to have warships in the Black Sea. And we are now talking about the Montreux Convention from the 1930s, which is complicated and restrictive. Why not change it? Why not demilitarize the Black Sea again? And why not demilitarize the Baltic Sea also? Åland was the islands between Sweden and Finland were demilitarized as a consequence of the Crimean War also. So the demilitarization of these two places where the Russians have navies sounds like a good idea to me. But of course, this is not currently being discussed, but it should be discussed. And if you take the Baltic Sea, only 3% of the coast is now Russian. Kaliningrad and a little bit around St. Petersburg. Ukraine bombed Ust-Luga, one of the two big oil terminals around St. Petersburg, and that is a good way forward. Perhaps the best is that Ukraine bombs the oil terminals, as it has also bombed Tuapse at the Black Sea. So you see, President Zelensky says repeatedly that Ukrainian bombing of oil facilities in Russia are the best sanctions against Russian oil exports. Russia is very vulnerable. And the problem is that the West is so weak, as was pointed out previously, not touching the Russian assets for no good reason whatsoever. Max? Yep.
I think on the percentages, one of the other things that you want to include, I'm sorry, my name is Max Pajor. I'm with the Energy Policy Research Foundation. I'll be presenting later on. I'm sorry to usurp the agricultural interest here on the panel. You mentioned the percentages of transit one thing. There's also Vladivostok and the related ports around there through which oil is transited out of Russia. In my remarks later this afternoon, I'll say something about what's taking place between refined products and crude oil. But there's also this notion of the right of innocent passage as far as what's taking place moving through the Baltic, the Danish Straits. My colleague here, Matthew, knows a lot more about this than I do. If you'd like to hear, this is to answer Yaroslav Martiniuk over there.
Leave it to the energy session.
I'm getting confused here by the comments here. So leave it for later?
Yeah, leave it to the energy session. Walter. Wait for Mike.
There's something stimulated by Kent in terms of meat production.
Talking to the mic.
Yeah, it was something mentioned by Kent in terms of meat production. I was very surprised because Ukrainians essentially had meat in their diet, a lot of meat. But you've made it clear that it was sort of backyard kind of, had the cow and so on and so forth. I know they always had some chickens and so on and so forth. So that was their protein. Now, the other side is the grain, and the grain has gone small, but also large. So we've talked about grain and we've talked about meat, but the third, and Ambassador Waschuk is here, and I would ask Pavlo, I would ask Andres, there is a place in those back gardens that produced all this enormous fruit and vegetable, and that fruit and vegetable industry. It wasn't really an industry. It was a kind of back of the house, and then off on the side of the road they would. But I'm surprised by. I remember in Kherson, even in 1990, I was there, and there was the women were selling all these kavune, marvelous stuff. Is there any sort of place? And I'm going to ask maybe upon the Roman. Is there any place where that's developed? The marmalades and all this, because Pavlo mentioned that, it's not just the raw thing, let's say raspberries and strawberries, but the production of canned goods and jarred goods and stuff like that. All of that is part of that whole agricultural and industrial sector. So are there any thoughts on that section of food?
I think we should turn that question to Pavlo, who's actually in business.
Thank you.
Якщо війна продлиться ще, мабуть, 1 рік,
If the war continues another year,
то нікому не буде робити у страні.
so there'll be nobody to work. There'll be no workers
Тому що це є
in the country.
одна із основних проблем в Україні.
Because this is one of the basic problems of Ukraine.
Але производство працює.
But industry is working.
І, наприклад, у Умані є дуже потужний комплекс
So in Uman, there's a very large facility
з вирощуванням овощей.
which grows vegetables.
На жаль, там немає переробки.
Unfortunately, they don't have processing there.
Ну, якраз я про це і говорив, що треба це робити.
And I talked about that this needs to be done.
Треба переробляти кукурудзу на біоетанол.
So you need to process corn into bioethanol.
Сьогодні у Америці із 100% кукурудзи, які вони вирощують, 50% вони переробляють.
So out of the 100% of corn which is grown in the United States, 50% is processed.
А в Україні це 0,2, 0,3, 0,5%.
In Ukraine, it's 0.1 or 2 or 3%.
Якщо Україна буде переробляти,
If Ukraine is going to be processing,
ви сказали насчет Європи,
you said with regard to Europe,
це не буде добре для Європи.
this won't be good for Europe,
Але це треба робити в
but
Україні.
it needs to be done in Ukraine.
Спасибі.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. This was a very important point about the labor market. I gave a talk at the US-Ukraine Business Council when I was in Kiev, and everybody complained about the shortage of labor as the biggest problem they have. I understand we have Timothy Milovanov. Roman, sorry.
Yeah.
Roman, please.
Let me give you a slightly less apocalyptic view of some of these segments. What is interesting and what is happening, for example, is in the field of nuts. So Ukraine is now the world's fourth largest exporter of walnuts. And unlike the US, where you have large plantations of walnut trees, in Ukraine, this is bought from thousands of those small backyard producers that Walter was talking about. The same goes for honey. We have in fact been defending the rights of honey packagers and producers and exporters in the face of a tax office that wants to trace it back to the individual and tax the individual producer. So yes, there are models that have been developed, in some cases cooperative, in some cases strictly commercially based, for tapping into that large remaining reservoir of small producers, consolidating what they generate, and then package it and sell it to international markets.
Thank you very much. And with that, I think that we should close the session. Thank you. Let's see one remaining question. Let's take it privately.
Thank you, panel. But я хочу подякувати панові Павлові за його автентичні слова і те, що є потрібно, щоб Україна пішла від перемоги до перемоги. Дякую вам.
Амінь. Дай Бог.
Officially announce our wonderful lunch. This rest club is